Hello, and we're going to get started here with lesson 2.03, Conditional Statements. Don't forget to give me your course number, which is like 203A or 204A, and your section number with all communication so that way I can get you help faster. The objectives of this lesson are to write conditional statements, identify parts of conditional statements, and write and identify forms of conditional statements. So here in Unit 2 you're going to think, this isn't very much math, but it's going to be, I promise. Here's some new terms that we're going to be going over. Conclusion, well, that one's not too new. We covered it in the last lesson. It says, in an argument, the answer that is reached at the end of the statement of premises is a conditional statement, the words following the word then. Okay? And that's going to be easier to understand once we start studying it. Conditional statement is a statement in the if-then form, or if P then Q, where if implies the conclusion, which is the end part, and the if implies the hypothesis, which is the if part. And then we'll talk more in depth about contrapositive and converse, and the hypothesis in a conditional statement, the words that follow if and precede then, and we'll talk more about inverse and negate in just a moment as well. First, let's talk about conditional statements. Conditional statements are made up of two parts. It will always have an hypothesis and a conclusion. The hypothesis is the if part. It is the statement immediately following the word then, immediately following the word if, but before the word then. And when we get going in class, we'll say, okay, a hypothesis follows the word if. Okay? And then the conclusion is the then part, and is the statement that immediately follows the word then. Okay? So the hypothesis follows if, conclusion follows then. Here's an example. It says, if I am a skunk, then I stink. So see, I've highlighted in blue here, I am a skunk, and that's going to be our hypothesis. And it follows the word if. And then over here in red, I have I stink, which is the conclusion following the word then. Alright, it's pretty simple, the conditional statement part. But of course they're going to make it difficult, okay? Now we're going to talk about the converse of a conditional statement. Whenever you switch the hypothesis and the conclusion in a conditional statement, you create a new conditional statement known as the converse of the original. So here's the original that I just showed you in the previous example. It says, if I'm a skunk, then I stink. Here's the converse. Remember up here it says I'm going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So that's going to look like this. If I stink, then I am a skunk. Okay? Now let's talk about the inverse of a conditional statement. You can change the meaning of the hypothesis to its opposite and the conclusion to its opposite. This is how you negate the hypothesis and conclusion in a conditional statement. So when we talk about negating, all we're saying is that we're going, whatever it is, we're going to make it the opposite, kind of like positive and negative. Here's the original statement. If I am a skunk, then I stink. So if I'm going to negate the hypothesis and negate the conclusion, this is how I would say it. If I am not a skunk, then I do not stink. The word not is our negator. That's the word we use to negate. Now if the word not is already in it and we want the opposite, then we just take not out. Alright, one more. It's called the contrapositive. Now you can both, I kind of didn't finish the sentence there. Now you can do both a converse and an inverse to the original statement. This guy right here is going, what? So here's your original. If I am a skunk, then I stink. Here's the contrapositive. Look, we're flipping the conclusion or the hypothesis and conclusion. That would make it a converse. And then I'm going to negate it with the word not, which is the inverse. So I'm doing both of those. It says if I do not stink, then I am not a skunk. So let's look at some examples. Identify the hypothesis and conclusion of each statement. It says if the side length of a square is b, then the area of the square is b squared. So look here, I highlighted the hypothesis in blue. I highlighted the conclusion in red. So my hypothesis is going to read the side length of square b. My conclusion is going to be the area of the square is b squared. So when you're writing your hypothesis and conclusion, you do not include the word if, you do not include the word then. Same kind of problem. If a football player scores a touchdown, then the player's team earns 6 points. So I highlighted in blue the hypothesis, highlighted in red the conclusion. So I'm going to write my hypothesis without the word if. A football player scores a touchdown. Writing my conclusion, leaving out the word then. The player's team earns 6 points. Okay, in this example it says for each statement do the following. We're going to write the conditional in the if-then form. We're going to identify the hypothesis, identify the conclusion. We're going to write the converse, then we'll write the inverse, and we'll write the contrapositive. So here's our statement. N equals 8 implies that n squared equals 64. So here's A. We're going to write the conditional in the if-then form. If n equals 8, then n squared equals 64. Notice that we put in the words if and then. Okay, don't forget your comma. But we made it into a conditional statement. B says identify the hypothesis. And remember, your hypothesis always follows the word if. So n equals 8 is going to be your hypothesis. Part C says identify the conclusion. And remember, your conclusion follows the word then. So n squared equals 64 is going to be your conclusion. D says write the converse. Well, remember, the converse is just flipping the hypothesis and the conclusion. So this is how it reads. If n squared equals 64, then n equals 8. See, all I did was switch places. Part E says write the inverse. Remember, the inverse says I'm going to take that conditional statement like in part A, and I'm going to put the word not in it. Well, now in mathematics we don't use the word not, so this is what it's going to look like. It says if n does not, that's what this means, equal sign with a line through it. If n does not equal 8, then n squared does not equal 64. So that's what your inverse looks like. F says, okay, you're going to take your conditional statement and you're going to use the converse. And after you do the converse, you're going to negate it. Okay, so I'm going to flip the hypothesis and conclusion, and then I'm going to negate. So this is what F looks like. Oh, I forgot to square my 2. It says if n squared does not equal 64, then n does not equal 8. So if your inverse gets a little, your contrapositive gets a little confusing, just think you're taking your inverse and you're flipping the hypothesis and conclusion. because that's what you're doing as well. Here's another example. It says for each statement do the following. Write the converse of each statement and determine whether the converse is true or false. This says if a triangle has 3 acute angles, then the triangle is an acute triangle. Okay, so let's write the converse. If a triangle is an acute triangle, then it has 3 acute angles. See, all I did was flip the hypothesis and conclusion. Part B says, determine whether the converse is true or false. Well, if a triangle is an acute triangle, then it has 3 acute angles. That means none of the angles are obtuse and none of them are right. So it's going to be true. And that was part B. The summary of today's lesson is we learned that conditional statements are statements that may be written in the if-then form. The part between if and then is called the hypothesis. The part after then is called the conclusion. And by changing the initial conditional statement, you can create other conditional statements, which are the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. And I like this graphic that they put in the LMS. It says take your conditional statement. If you switch the hypothesis and conclusion, you're going to get a converse. If you negate the hypothesis and conclusion, you're going to get an inverse. If you switch and negate the hypothesis and conclusion, you're going to make it a contrapositive. What you should be doing after you watch the video is view the LMS lesson 2.03 and complete the student guide. Read through pages 37 through 41 in the reference guide. And complete the following problems in the problem set, which are 1 through 15 odd. Contact me or attend TOGA if you have any questions before completing the 2.03 quiz. And make note of any general questions you may have when you attend CC on Thursday. And that's going to be it for this lesson. Thanks for listening.